even though all of these people have different Christian views, and we could have gone into the theology a little bit more and we've seen quite a bit of difference, they're still coming from this Christian standpoint of, right, there are reasons why one should be an abolitionist. A lot of that is reflected in a general attitude in, especially in the United States and Great Britain through the 19th century, that true Christianity was expressed in social concern and activism. Although when we get into the 20th century and we talk about evangelicalism and fundamentalism and some other groups like this, which are the spiritual descendants of some of the people we're talking about, their attitudes often were, let's focus on saving souls. It should be about converting individuals, not being that active in society. A lot of 19th century evangelicals felt that true Christianity was worked out in changing society for the better. And many of these Christians worked to establish a variety of organizations meant to address all sorts of religious and social issues. One of the issues that a lot of evangelicals were concerned about was religious education. And so you have groups like the American Sunday School Union, the American Bible and Tract Society, the focus of which was to promote religious knowledge. And so sharing religious literature, copies of the Bible, these were the kind of things that organizations like this were involved in. And although a lot of Christians think of Sunday school maybe as something that's always been around, before the 19th century it didn't really exist. It's only in the end of the 18th century and into the 19th century that we see the organizations of Sunday schools. The Sunday school movement started in England, and a lot of the focus in those early years was not so much on religious education as general education. A lot of the focus was teaching poor kids how to read, social skills. Right? These are the kind of things that are being taught in these Sunday schools. Right? Teach them hygiene, manners. With the thought being that as children are educated and enlightened, they will become Christians. Right? And so the focus is on educating them in some of these general things, and eventually they will morph into Christians. And so for a lot of this early Sunday school, the Bible was a textbook toward a better life. Now, in general, we probably all agree with that, right? But we don't think of it in the sense of, teaching hygiene and manners. We think about, all right, you're a Christian now versus, your life before. And so the Sunday school movement was basically a social cause. And the reason it was done on Sunday is because we're talking in a time period before there were child labor laws. And so children were working during the week, and so Sunday was really the only opportunity for any sort of education. And so it was general education, not any sort of spiritual formation. It's when the Sunday school movement makes its way to the United States in the early 19th century that it starts to become more about salvation and spiritual formation. Now, evangelicals especially had rather complex views on children. Coming from the Calvinist strand of the Reformation, many evangelicals affirmed the idea of original sin and moral depravity. And if you remember back to the idea of tulip from Calvinism, that T for total depravity, right? Children are born sinful. Right? Children are born morally degenerate. And so this idea was a lot of the focus of these evangelicals. But with the influence of John Locke, a lot of evangelicals started to think, well, maybe actually children are born innocent, right, as blank slates. And so what they become is what you put into them. And so you have this total depravity on the one side, innocence on the other side. They kind of get melded in the 19th century, and they're at war with each other. And you can even see this even in today's literature about children and Christianity. There is this, we've got to fight against their devil nature. right? In books on teaching them how to sit still during church, and teaching them against their anger and their violence and bullying. Right? But then on the other hand, they're spiritual gods. Right? There's an innocence to children. So these two ideas are kind of at war with each other in the evangelical mind, and this kind of cognitive dissonance takes over, where they're kind of both held in tension. And so you have this total depravity on the one side and kind of this sentimental, spiritual innocence, spiritual gods on the other side. And this is evident even in work like Uncle Tom's Cabin. I don't know if you've read Uncle Tom's Cabin or not, but one of the major characters in the first part of the book is the daughter of the slave master. Her name's Little Eva, which is short for Evangelina, which is, of course, coming from that Greek word where we get evangelist, evangelism, right, good news. So even her name is suggesting who she is as a character. Well, she's kind of the spiritual guide of the book. And she's the one who is encouraging her father to give up his slaves. She's the one that's working for the religious education of the slaves, right? And so this idea of children know better about Christianity, about religious themes. Now, in the 19th century, this notion that spiritual formation and education are important was often reflected with a change in the theology as well, especially in New England, as you get this more moderate evangelicalism and moderate Calvinism. And so it's not so much about the point of conversion for a lot of these New England evangelicals as it is about this idea of a lifelong process. And so this notion, as it became known as Christian nurture, this idea you form your child's character throughout life. Ultimately, a lot of the liberal evangelicals thought, wouldn't it be better to take your children and from birth educate them, form their character, shape them, instead of encouraging them to kind of wallow in their sinful nature, right, and hope that there's a moment somewhere in their future where they're going to convert. And so Sunday schools in the United States began to fit into this desire. And so the focus often became about educating children in Christian communities, but then also beginning to reach out to those that might not have been converted. And groups like the American Sunday School Union served to try and find a way to unite denominations by producing literature that could be used, whether it was a Baptist church, a Methodist church, an Episcopalian church, and to try and keep everybody, keep some unity across the Christian groups in the United States. And then often a lot of this literature was produced so that what the children were learning in the Sunday school was also being taught to adults in their education program as well. And so part of this interest in social reform comes from these educational institutions being formed by Christians. A second part of this was missionary societies. Often many of these missionary societies were connected with specific denominations, right? The Missionary Society for Baptists, the Missionary Society for Methodists. But there were some missionary societies that crossed denominational borders. But what we see here in the United States for the first time is kind of this, instead of missionaries coming to the United States, as we've seen so much through the colonial period, we're now seeing missionaries go out of the United States to a variety of places, to Africa, to places like India and the Far East. Here too, a lot of it focused in denominational ties, but also this kind of notion of kind of an ecumenical Christianity, right? And so there are people that want to keep their denominational ties. Others say we need to be working together, even across denominational lines. A third expression of this attempt to reform society were organizations connected with social reform specifically. And so you had people endeavoring to encourage temperance. Now, temperance probably might not be a term that you've heard of before, but temperance was connected with alcohol. And so it was an encouragement to limit your alcohol intake or completely get rid of alcohol in your life. In fact, if you've heard the term teetotaler, right, was a person who totally committed to temperance and completely got rid of drinking alcohol. For a lot of these Christians, alcohol was a gateway to a variety of other problems, violence, improper behavior, and so they felt that if they would attack the root cause, it would then help with a variety of other situations. And so issues related to alcohol, prostitution, not only trying to help people engaged in it, but also trying to get rid of the institution as well. Involved in prison reform, trying to deal with some of the issues that prisoners face, as well as trying to make the prison system more reformative and not just punitive, right? And so that when prisoners would get out, they would have been educated, they would be less likely to reoffend, those kind of things, and then just general obscenity, and trying to get rid of improper talk, swearing, those kind of things. Now, often, these societies attempted to, and frequently achieved, the legislation of morality. So it wasn't just trying to convince somebody, it was trying to convince the government to pass laws against obscenity, blasphemy, other things like that. And in fact, in many places, a lot of Sabbath laws were passed as well about what you could and could not do on Sundays. And so this idea of separation of church and state is not really separation of church and state completely, right? A lot of the church is influencing these laws in the United States. But you also have the development of hospitals and orphanages, all sorts of things that are meant to bring about social reform. And a good example of an institution that was kind of connected with this, that developed in the 19th century, was the Salvation Army. We could also talk about the YMCA and eventually the YWCA, which are started as a young men's Christian association, right? We often think of the Y as someplace you go to exercise. Well, the idea behind the Y was that exercise and religious character went together, right? And so it was about developing religious character. But I want to specifically focus on the Salvation Army. And all of these groups started in Great Britain and eventually came over to the United States. The Salvation Army was started by a man named William Booth and his wife Catherine. He was a Methodist minister in London in the middle of the 19th century. And one of the things he becomes concerned about is the poor and the homeless, people out in the streets. And so he starts preaching to those people. Ultimately, it leads him into trouble with his church. They're not particularly fond of him going about doing these things. And so eventually he just withdraws from the church and decides he's just going to travel, he's going to evangelize. And originally his goal is he's going to meet these people out in the street, in the poor houses, other places like that, preach to them, and then connect them with a church. Right? So he's not interested in starting a new denomination, and he's not interested in starting a church. He's a traveling evangelist who will then connect people to established churches. And he becomes very popular as a preacher. But many of the people that he's converting are criminals, people with questionable pasts, and they're not particularly welcome, or they don't particularly feel comfortable in churches. And so, he sees, okay, this is a problem. Right? I'm not being able to connect them to these churches. And so he decides, well, I'm going to start a mission group. And so the first version of all this is called the Christian Mission. And the group starts taking on employees that are helping minister to the homeless, the poor, and others. And a lot of Booth's focus is on sometimes the issue isn't just spiritual. Sometimes there has to be a physical need met before you can help them see their spiritual needs. And so the focus of the Christian Mission is not just preaching, it's also helping people find clothes and food, shelter for some time, maybe even work with them to help them find a job. And sometimes the group gets referred to as the Hallelujah Army. And Booth is sometimes referred to as the general, and his wife Catherine sometimes referred to as the mother. In 1878, Booth is reading a report, and in the report somebody has written that the Christian mission is a volunteer army. And Booth is said to have been disturbed by these phrases. I'm not a volunteer, I'm compelled to serve in this army. And so he crosses out volunteer army and writes in salvation. And so the name Salvation Army is born. And he really latches on to the idea of an army. They are God's army. And so the staff start wearing uniforms. And many of the main staff use ranks. And so a lieutenant in the Salvation Army, a colonel, a general. Eventually, of course, it comes to the United States and spreads to other countries throughout the world as well. And so, of course, it's this social interest that eventually leads to the people outside Walmart at Christmas ringing the bells with the red kettles. This is all kind of connected, even though you don't automatically think, oh, here's an attempt by somebody to express Christianity. But this is where it kind of comes out of, is this notion of helping other people and social reform. And so all these organizations become referred to as the benevolent empire. Right? People trying to reach out and change society. And the reason it's referred to as the benevolent empire is that many of these organizations, these first ones, not so much the Salvation Army, but the American Sunday School Union, the American Bible and Tract Society, a lot of them on their board of directors shared the same people. Right? And so there was, it's almost like an empire, and you have this small group of people that's kind of guiding each of these groups. And often, the general meetings of these groups will be held around the same time in New York City so that people could participate in more than one. Right? So there's social reform, but the leadership is all very closely connected. What questions do you have about the benevolent empire, or anything I need to clarify? Again, snapshots, right? In the 19th century, we have a lot we could say, even just about the benevolent empire. But rather fascinating expression of people trying to demonstrate the Christianity through social reform. While some